In December 1866, during Red Cloud's War, a fierce conflict triggered by U.S. expansion into the Powder River country, a powerful alliance of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors stood their ground against the U.S. Army, determined to protect their land, culture, and way of life. Led by the brilliant and fearless Crazy Horse, a group of 10 native warriors pulled off a daring maneuver. They lured Captain William Fetterman and his patrol away from Fort Phil Kearny into a deadly ambush. What followed became one of the most devastating defeats in U.S. military history. In just minutes, all 81 soldiers in Fetterman's command were wiped out. This wasn't just a battle, it was a message. It was a bold act of resistance and retaliation for repeated violations of native lands and lives, including the horrific Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where U.S. troops had slaughtered peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho villagers. The confrontation took place near Fort Phil Kearny, a military post built on land that was supposed to be protected under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. That treaty was the first major agreement between the U.S. government and several Northern Plains tribes. It was meant to create peace by setting aside large portions of Nebraska, South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming as native territory. In theory, the treaty was a compromise. The tribes would stop fighting each other, respect defined tribal boundaries, and pay damages if any of their members broke the rules. In exchange, the U.S. promised to keep settlers off native land, build only roads and forts with tribal permission, protect native people from encroaching whites, and provide $50,000 in supplies annually for 10 years, possibly for another 5 after that. But in practice, there were serious flaws. First, the U.S. government struggled to find representatives who could truly speak for their entire tribe. Many native societies didn't work that way. Second, some tribes didn't show up at all. Third, defining borders for tribes that moved seasonally to hunt buffalo or gather food made little sense to begin with. And to make matters worse, the treaty was written in English. Many native leaders didn't fully grasp what they were agreeing to. Tensions only got worse in 1863, when John Bozeman carved out a new route to the Montana goldfields, what became known as the Bozeman Trail. It stretched 680 miles through some of the most sacred and resource-rich native lands, territory explicitly guaranteed to the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Lakota, and Crow in the 1851 treaty. These lands weren't just homes, they were vital hunting grounds filled with deer, elk, and mountain sheep. But now, wagon trains trampled through them. Draft animals and livestock devoured grasslands. Settlers disrupted hunts and claimed land. In response, native warriors began launching attacks to drive the intruders out. Then came one of the most infamous atrocities in U.S. history. In 1864, Colorado militiamen attacked a peaceful native camp, killing and mutilating around 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho, most of them women and children, in what became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. The massacre ignited a firestorm. Native warriors took up arms in vengeance, striking white settlers across the plains and targeting those traveling the Bozeman Trail. In 1865, in an attempt to stop the bloodshed, the U.S. negotiated the Little Arkansas Treaty with several plains, tribes, but it was too little, too late. Many tribal leaders refused to sign it. Hostilities raged on. The war for the plains and for native survival was far from over. In 1866, the U.S. government summoned thousands of Lakota to gather at Fort Laramie. Their goal? To negotiate a treaty that would allow settlers safe passage along the Bozeman Trail, a route cutting through sacred native lands. Many prominent native leaders attended, including the renowned Lakota war chief Red Cloud. But as the talks began, Colonel Henry B. Carrington arrived with a show of force, 700 soldiers and 300 civilians. His orders were to protect settlers traveling west through dangerous territory. But to the native leaders, this was no mere escort, it looked like an invasion. Red Cloud was furious. He saw through the government's promises. To him, the soldiers weren't there to ensure peace. They were there to steal land. Outraged, he refused to sign the treaty and stormed out. One by one, other chiefs and warriors followed his lead. In response, the U.S. government doubled down. That same year, they built a chain of forts along the Bozeman Trail. The largest and most important was Fort Phil Kearny, constructed in north-central Wyoming under Carrington's command. He and 400 soldiers, along with most of the civilians, were stationed there. During one of his journeys from the fort, Carrington met with Lakota chief Standing Elk. Though his people desired peace, Standing Elk warned that not all Lakota bands had agreed to the earlier Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. He also told Carrington that the Cheyenne and Arapaho had now joined the Lakota resistance. Native frustration had reached a breaking point. Red Cloud would not back down. In a passionate speech, he rallied his people with fire and clarity. "Hear me, Dakotas, when the Great Father in Washington sent his chief soldier to ask for a road through our lands, a path for his iron trail to the mountains and the western sea, we were told it was only to pass through, not to stay. Our old chiefs welcomed them, wanting peace. But before the ashes of the council fire had cooled, the white man built forts on our land. You have heard the sound of the soldier's axe cutting into the pines. His presence here is an insult to us, to our ancestors. Are we to give up their sacred graves to be plowed for corn? Dakotas, I choose war." His words ignited a movement. Lakota warriors, joined by Cheyenne and Arapaho allies, launched a full-scale campaign that came to be known as Red Cloud's War. Their focus, Fort Phil Kearny. They attacked constantly, harassing soldiers, ambushing supply teams, and targeting the fort's most vulnerable need, timber. In the late 19th century, the American West was a boiling cauldron. The gold rush, railroads, and dreams of expansion pushed thousands of settlers into lands that had long belonged to indigenous nations. Among those nations were the Ute, an ancient people of the Rocky Mountains. In 1879, a brutal clash of cultures, ideologies, and greed would erupt into one of the bloodiest and most tragic episodes in Colorado's indigenous history, the Battle of Milk Creek and the Meeker Massacre. This is the story of a forgotten war, a conflict that marked the end of the Ute presence in their own homeland. The Ute had lived across vast regions of what is now Colorado and Utah for generations. They were hunters, warriors, and diplomats, intimately familiar with every valley, mountain, and river of their territory. But with the expansion of the United States, their land began to shrink. Treaties were signed, and nearly always broken. In 1868, the U.S. government granted the Ute a reservation in Colorado, but in return demanded they abandon their traditional ways. No more horses, no more hunting, no more ceremonies. They were to become Christian farmers. Enter Nathan Meeker. An idealist, a journalist, and a devout Christian, Meeker believed he could civilize the Ute. Appointed as Indian agent at the White River Agency in 1878, he arrived with a mission to turn the Ute into peaceful Christian farmers. But his utopia quickly became authoritarian. He banned horse racing, a core cultural practice for the Ute. He tore up horse pastures to plant crops. He threatened to cut off food rations to anyone who refused to obey. To the Ute, this wasn't help. It was cultural extermination. Tensions rose week by week. Meeker refused to distribute food. He insisted that farming was the only acceptable way of life. He even got into a physical altercation with a Ute spiritual leader. Terrified, Meeker wrote to the military, begging for reinforcements. But to the Ute, this wasn't a plea for safety. It was a declaration of war. General William Sherman, yes, the same from the Civil War, ordered troops to be sent in. In late September of 1879, nearly 200 soldiers marched out from Fort Steele, led by Major Thomas Thornburg. As the army approached the White River Agency, Meeker still insisted things were under control. But the Ute had already made their decision. They would not allow armed soldiers to enter their lands. On September 29th, as the troops crossed a small stream known as Milk Creek, they were ambushed. Horses bolted in panic. Bullets flew from every direction. Major Thornburg was killed within minutes. The Ute, skilled and determined, opened fire with deadly precision. The remaining soldiers scrambled for cover behind wagons and the bodies of dead animals. The Battle of Milk Creek had begun 4 days, roughly 150 soldiers held their ground under constant assault. They were surrounded, low on food and water, and under relentless fire. Men died slowly. Animals collapsed in agony. Morale disintegrated. Desperate for help, a few soldiers slipped away at night and rode over 140 miles to summon reinforcements. Finally, on October 2nd, the first backup arrived, the legendary Buffalo Soldiers, the all-black 9th Cavalry. 3 days later, nearly 500 more troops led by General Wesley Merritt reached the battlefield and broke the siege. But what happened at Milk Creek was only half the tragedy. While the army was bleeding in battle, the White River Agency itself fell into chaos. The Ute attacked. Nathan Meeker and 10 of his staff were killed. The agency buildings were burned to the ground. But contrary to the sensational headlines calling it a savage massacre, the Ute spared the women and children. They were taken as hostages, not prisoners. Among them were Josephine Meeker, Nathan's daughter, and her mother, Arvilla. They were protected, watched over by Chipeta, the wife of Chief Ouray. Josephine would later say that Chipeta's kindness saved her life. The nation was stunned. Newspapers cried for revenge. Politicians shouted, "The Utes must go!" Even Chief Ouray, who had always pushed for peace, couldn't stop what came next. Under intense pressure, the Ute were forced to sign a new treaty. In 1880, most of them were removed from Colorado and relocated to remote land in the Utah Territory, stripped of their homeland. Chief Ouray died a year later, in 1881. Some say, of a broken heart. The Battle of Milk Creek and the Meeker Massacre marked the end of Ute resistance in Colorado, and it signaled the broader collapse of indigenous autonomy in the Rocky Mountains. For decades, history painted the Ute as violent, aggressors. But today we know better. Nathan Meeker may have meant well, but he imposed his vision through force and cultural erasure. The Ute defended their land, their freedom, and their identity, just as any people would. Today, the descendants of the Ute live on in southern Colorado and Utah. They still sing, they still dance, they still remember, and in the quiet valleys of Milk Creek, if you listen closely, you might still hear the echo of what was lost, and a warning we have yet to truly understand.